Last year, Verizon commissioned an academic study. Their goal was to determine how kind Americans are. And so they began asking a series of questions to people in this study. Questions like, would you adopt and raise a family member if it was necessary? Would you cover a work shift for a colleague? Would you call a friend to encourage them? My personal favorite kindness question that they asked was, would you donate part of your liver to a family member who was in need? 86% of Americans said yes, they would do that. Interestingly, as they compiled the results from this study, they said, we're going to let you know which state in America is the kindest state. Got any ideas? What state in America do you think is the kindest state? Yeah. I thought they were going to say Minnesota, right? Minnesota, nice. Yeah. Not a thing. They didn't even make the top 10. The kindest state in America is Kentucky. I have no idea why, but I thought that was cool. You know what it revealed to me, though? This study tells me that people are looking for kindness. Christmas is a season where we expect kindness to prevail. At Christmas, we want to experience most especially God's kindness. And Christmas is a time when we celebrate, after all, Emmanuel, a God with us. God was so kind that he chose to leave heaven and come to live and dwell among us. But maybe here, as we come upon this Christmas season, if you were being honest, you would say, I'm not sure I feel like God is with me. I'm not sure I feel like I'm experiencing God's kindness. I'm not sure that life is going the way I thought life was supposed to go. When we read a verse like Psalm 27, verse 13, where it says, surely I will experience the goodness of God in the land of the living. And you're like, but I'm not sure if I'm going to experience the goodness of God because there's so much stuff. And if you're going through stuff, that's why we chose this holiday series. That's why for Christmas this year, we're looking at the 5 women who appeared in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. Because the family tree of Jesus is filled with people who needed a kindness transfusion in their broken, hard, and difficult lives. And so as we walk through these women who are named in Jesus' genealogy, surprised by the fact that we're not seeing the great matriarchs of Israel's faith, but instead we're seeing the strugglers and the stragglers. We come for the third woman in Jesus' genealogy, to Ruth. And perhaps you know the story of Ruth. Maybe you grew up in Sunday school hearing about Ruth. There's an entire book of the Bible, 4 full chapters devoted to her story. What we're going to do this morning is an overview of Ruth's story. So if you have your copy of God's Word, you might want to get it open to the book of Ruth. We're going to be doing the Cliff's Note version. We don't have time to break down every verse in all 4 chapters. Instead, we're going to be doing the 30,000-foot flyover, pointing out the key lessons that we can learn from her life. There are 2 key words that dominate the book of Ruth. The first key word in the book of Ruth is the Hebrew word hesed. It is often translated loving kindness. In the book of Ruth, there will be characters that show loving kindness to one another. But more importantly, God himself will show loving kindness, specifically to a young woman named Ruth. The second key word in the book of Ruth is goel in Hebrew. It means redeemer. And that leads to the main point this morning as we talk about kindness and redemption. God's kindness redeems real people with real problems. Ruth is a book that helps us take the concept of kindness from an idea to a lived reality. There's a big difference, isn't there, between God is kind and God has been kind to me. There's a big difference, isn't there, between God is loving and God has shown his love in my life. And what I'd like to see for you this Christmas is to lean into the Lord so that you could join in with the testimony of the saints of old, like Ruth, and say, God has been kind to me. God is good to me. But maybe like Ruth, you're wondering, is God going to be kind to me when life is so hard? Well, let's tell Ruth's story and see how Ruth goes from someone who's experienced the roughest, hardest parts of life to, on the flip side, leaving a testimony of, I've experienced the grace and the goodness and the loving kindness of God. So let's start Ruth's story with this point. We need kindness. In the story, Ruth is the one who needs kindness. Maybe you can relate to Ruth this morning. You know, we all come into the holiday season, we all come into church this morning with stuff. And I don't know what your stuff is, but I bet if we all sat around in a circle and took time to share, how's your year been? How are things going in your family? How are things going in just general circumstances? We'd all walk around, we all say, man, I got stuff. Like there's hard stuff going on in my family. Maybe there's hard stuff going on with some health diagnoses that you have. Maybe there's some hard stuff going on with your kids. Maybe there's some hard stuff going on at work. Like I don't know where your stuff is, but I'm pretty confident in saying you probably have some stuff. And when you have that hard stuff like Ruth, you come in and you say, I need kindness. Why did Ruth need kindness in this story? Ruth needed kindness because she had the wrong background. Let's read the first couple verses, and I want you to pay specific attention in verse 4 when we get there to how Ruth is introduced. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife, Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. That is depressing. But that's how the book of Ruth starts. Now, I want you to notice how Ruth was introduced. She was introduced as a Moabite. And the book of Ruth doesn't let us forget that point. Chapter 1, verse 22, chapter 2, verse 2, chapter 2, verse 21, chapter 4, verse 5, chapter 4, verse 10. It keeps calling Ruth all throughout the story, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite. You're like, why does the author keep pounding home the point that Ruth was a Moabite? Because being a Moabite was, to an Israelite, having the worst possible background. Moabites were ethnically related to the nation of Israel, but the relationship was not good. In fact, to understand why the Israelites had such a thing against the Moabites, you have to understand where the nation of Moab came from. So let's get our Sunday school research on. And do you guys remember Lot? So Abraham, right, the great founder of the nation of Israel, he had this black sheep nephew, Lot, and Lot wanted to go live in Sodom and Gomorrah, which wasn't a great place to purchase real estate, but Lot and his family were in Sodom and Gomorrah, and you remember the deal, right? God's like, I'm going to sulfur from the sky Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot's like, hey, God, will you call off the fire invasion if we find 50 righteous people? God's like, sure. Lot's like trying to negotiate him down, right? He's like, how about 25? How about 10? And there aren't even that few righteous people. And so Sodom and Gomorrah get what's the equivalent of nuked from heaven. And so they're charred, right? And so Lot and his family's fleeing. And God's like, don't turn back and look. And Lot's wife's like, I'm just going to turn back and look. And remember her, right? She turned into a pillar of salt. And so pick up the story there. And Lot and his 2 daughters have fled. Their cities are like apocalypse nowed. Lot's wife is Salt, and they're hiding out in a cave. So at that point, and I'm not trying to excuse where this story's going, but I'm trying to explain it so that you understand what's going on here, right? They probably thought they were like the last people left on earth. because they just watched a fireball take out their city and the next door neighbor city. They just watched mom get obliterated. And so Lot's daughters are sitting there thinking, we're it. We're like the World War Z survivors here. And if there's going to be a human race, it's up to us to perpetuate the human race. But there's just the two of us and dad. And well, if you see where that story's going, that's kind of exactly where that story went. And Lot's oldest daughter had a son that her dad fathered and named that son Moab. And so the nation of Israel came from Abraham and his offspring. The nation of Moab came from Moab and his offspring. And the people of Israel looked at where Moab came from and they said, that's gross. And then to make things worse, the nation of Moab hated the nation of Israel, refused to help the nation of Israel when the Israelites were fleeing out of Egypt on their way to the promised land. And just in case you're like, well, what did God think about the nation of Moab? We actually have that recorded for us in Scripture. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 3-6. Here's what it says. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. Why? Verse 4, because they didn't meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt, because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. But the Lord your God wouldn't listen to Balaam. Instead, the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loved you. But verse 6, you shall not seek the peace of the Moabites or their prosperity all your days forever. So, Ruth's a Moabite. The author of the book of Ruth wants us to get that and wants us to look at Ruth the same way someone from Israel would have looked at Ruth. You're from the wrong place. You're from the wrong race. You belong to a people who have not received grace. You're an outsider and an outcast. That's Ruth. If you've got the wrong background or the wrong backstory, people can be horrifically unkind. Just a quick story to illustrate that from recent American history. The year was 1962. This story was recorded in a book by Indiana Wesleyan professor J. Russell Hawkins. The book is called The Bible Told Them So, How Southern Evangelicals Fought to Preserve White Supremacy. I found this story fascinating. The year was 1962. There was a young black man named Harvey Gantt who wanted to enroll as a student at Clemson University. So he showed up at campus to enroll as a student. There was federal laws that all schools had to be integrated. And so this young man shows up looking for the registrar's office so he can sign up for classes. But Southern universities weren't super interested in integrating in 1962. So their strategy was to kind of like hide the registrar's office in some super out of the way location so that nobody could find it. And so this young guy shows up on campus. He's looking for the registrar's office, and he can't find it. It was kind of one of those if you know things, but you're not supposed to know if you're not the right kind of person. And so there was a pastor on campus that day, and that pastor's name was Charles Webster. He was a pastor from Clemson First Baptist Church, not the main pastor, one of the assistant pastors. His role was college ministry. So he's on campus doing college ministry, and he sees this young black guy showing up to sign up for classes. And he looked lost, and he's like, I'm looking for the registrar's office. And the pastor said, oh, yeah, it's just over there. The officials from Clemson University were so enraged that the pastor pointed this young man to the registrar's office that they called the church office and demanded to speak to church leaders. Within a week, the deacon board, which is kind of like the governing board of a Baptist church, had met, and the pastor was told that they wanted his resignation on their desk within a week. He never pastored in a Baptist church again the rest of his life. Like, if you're from the wrong place, if you're from the wrong race, people can be brutal. And Ruth was from the wrong place. Ruth was from the wrong race. And the story wants you to understand just how bad Moab is. So here's what's going on in the story. There's a famine in the nation of Israel, and there's this random guy, he and his wife, and they decide that they're going to leave where the famine is to go find some food. Interestingly, the man's name is Elimelech. In Hebrew, the word Elimelech means, my God is king. So the dude whose name is my God is king decides that he needs to leave God's land to go find some food. Now, quick question. If God's man leaves God's land to go live among the Moabites, who we've already said are kind of, you think God's in favor of this dude leaving God's land? Like good decision, bad decision to leave God's land, right? Like bad decision, right? Bad decision. Could not the God who provided manna in the wilderness have provided food for this man and his family? Just as Lot's daughters took it upon themselves to try and fix a problem that they thought was going on, this man takes it upon himself to try and fix the problem of famine by going to live in Moab, a place where God said he was not present. Things went about as well as you would expect. You see in just the first few verses that he dies. That's when Ruth the Moabite enters the story. The man's two sons each take wives. His oldest son marries Orpah. The younger son marries Ruth. So pretty sure by name order that Ruth's husband was Chilion. We don't know if Chilion was a good dude. We don't know if he was a bad dude. We just know that he was a dead dude. The only thing that the text tells us is that he didn't live to see their 10th anniversary. Ruth not only had the wrong background, Ruth had a broken life. See, Hebrew readers would have expected that the Israelite family deserved God's kindness. The Moabite did not deserve God's kindness. So if the original readers from the nation of Israel would have read this, they would have been like, of course the Moabite deserves death and destruction, but not the Israelite family. Interestingly, Ruth gets connected with an Israelite family in rebellion, and she shares in their deserved misery. They've fled God's land. They've lost God's blessing. They've chosen to forfeit it. Hardship, death, devastation lies in the wake. Naomi, Elimelech's wife, and now her two daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth, all three of them are left with no husband. No husband in that ancient Near East culture meant there was no land. It meant there was no money. It meant there was no food. It meant there was no security. It meant they were not eligible for any coming inheritance. And then, in the midst of all of that, verse 6, then Naomi decided to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So Naomi gets wind, hey, the famine's over in Israel. And so Naomi looks at her daughter-in-laws and she's like, I'm going to peace out and go back to the place where I was born. And y'all can come with me or not, but I'm leaving. So now Ruth is left with no family. She's left with no money. She's left with no husband. Things have just gone from bad to worse. I can only imagine that this was not how Ruth had envisioned her life turning out. Ruth desperately needed kindness, but it looked like her life was going to be tragedy after tragedy after tragedy with no kindness to be found. And do you know somebody whose life has just been marked with struggle after struggle after struggle? You know, if you do ministry long enough, you're going to run into some people that have some stories. And if your life's been marked with struggle after struggle after struggle, eventually you start to think, not only am I not ever going to experience kindness, but maybe I don't even deserve kindness. And I don't know if you've ever felt that, but it's a dark and lonely place to be. I remember a young girl that I met when I was doing ministry in Ohio. She was around 20 years old. She was so riddled with anxiety because of her life story that she didn't even feel comfortable leaving her apartment. She had one of those low-income apartments that was infested with bed bugs because her life was just, she started telling me her story. We were ministering in this apartment complex, and I was able to meet with her, and she's like, nobody's ever cared about my story. I'm like, tell me your story. And she's like, okay. It's like, I had a single mom because my dad was never really involved. And when I was real young, my mom got drunk, and then she was driving while she was drunk, and she hit someone and killed them. And so my mom went to prison. And so I was sent to live with an aunt and uncle, and they were horrifically abusive. Her uncle, just for fun, would, when she was 8 years old, toss her in the dryer and turn it on, just the spin around cycle. No heat, but just force her to spin around in the dryer just to torment her. And she was abused all kinds of ways in that family. And so as soon as she was a teenager, she fled. And the only way she knew to get out was to get married. And so when she was 16, 17 years old, she married the first guy she found. And he was a drug addict, and he started just shooting her up with drugs. And she was so young and ignorant, she didn't even realize he was shooting drugs into her system. And so she found herself addicted to heroin, married, struggling. So she cold turkey, gets off drugs, flees from this guy who's horrifically abusive. And now she has this apartment at 20 years old. And she's like, nobody's going to love me. Nobody cares about what I've been through. Man, if you've been through stuff like that, can you imagine why you would think nobody cares about my stuff? Nobody cares about my struggle? And I tell you that story not because I want to say, man, there's some people out there that have it really, really bad, but because I want you to hear this. There is nobody that has it so bad that they are beyond the kindness of God. There is no one whom God's kindness cannot reach. And so I want you this morning, whether you picture yourself as the person in need of kindness, or whether you picture yourself as someone who's got life kind of okay, but there's these other people, I want you to say, God's kindness can reach me if I'm in stuff, or God's kindness can reach to those people that I might have written off because of their stuff. And how do we know? Because God's kindness is going to show up to Ruth. God's kindness shows up to people of faith. Now, I want you to notice the contrast here in the book of Ruth between Ruth the Moabite, remember Moabites, bad, and her mother-in-law, Naomi, the Israelite. Three things that Naomi does in the story. Chapter 1, verse 11, Naomi says to Orpah and Ruth, turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Do I yet have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? So if you were here last week, remember we talked about the whole concept of levirate marriage, that if a man died but he hadn't had a son, his brother was supposed to marry the widow and provide a son in the name of the person who was deceased so that the family line of the deceased man could continue. And there would be a male heir who would be able to provide for the mom or the widow in her aging years, because only men were eligible to own land, to own money, to have an inheritance. So Naomi says to her daughter-in-laws, we burned through both my boys. There's none left. Just go home. Verse 15, second thing. It says in verse 14, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. So Ruth's like, no, I'm not leaving you. I'm going with you. Naomi says to Ruth, verse 15, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. I don't want you to miss that part. Your sister-in-law has gone back where? To her people and to her gods. The nation of Moab didn't worship the Lord, but Naomi didn't care. Naomi wasn't trying to be a missionary. Naomi wasn't trying to lift high the name of Jesus Christ, the name of the God of Israel. Naomi wasn't trying to point Ruth towards the God who could sustain her. Naomi's just like, God stinks. Man, have you gone through some hard stuff in life to the point where you're like, I'm not even sure I trust God? That's where Naomi was. And Naomi trusted her God so little that she says to her daughter-in-law, just go on back to your gods. My God's got nothing for you. That's a dark place. Last thing I want you to see about Naomi, verse 20. She legally changes her name. She goes to the Social Security office, files a change of name form. She said to them, do not call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Call me Mara. She's like, my mom and dad named me Pleasant, but I'm changing my name to Bitter. Why? Because the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Here's someone who has given up. Here's someone who has kicked faith to the curb. Here's someone who has said, my God can't be trusted. Now, here's the thing. Ruth didn't grow up in Israel. Ruth didn't grow up worshiping Yahweh God. It would have been super easy for Ruth to be like, you know what? Yeah, your God hasn't really helped me out. I married your son and he died. I put my faith in your family and I got let down. It must be your God's fault. But in the midst of all this lack of faith, in the midst of all this bitterness from her mother-in-law, notice Ruth's response, verses 16 and 17. But Ruth said to Naomi, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. I don't know what Elimelech and Naomi and Mahlon and Chilion taught their wives in those few years they had before they died, but something must have stuck with Ruth. In the midst of all this pain, in the midst of all this struggle, in the midst of all this loss, the only thing she knew was that the God of her family, the God of Israel, was her only hope. If you're in the midst of questioning, does God love me? My answer to you is yes. And where else are you going to turn? To who else will you go? The first step Ruth took was a small step of faith. Orpah went back to what was comfortable and to what she knew, but Ruth took a step of faith. Ruth was like Abraham, leaving her country and her people to head toward the promised land. But you know, even Abraham had some super specific promises from God who had showed up and revealed himself to Abraham. Ruth just knew that God was kind. And she threw herself on the mercy of God. And she said, I'm going where you go. And I'm going to be where you are. And your God will be my God. If you're dealing with stuff this morning, my question for you is, what is your first small step of faith? God shows his kindness to people who step out in faith. Maybe you can muster enough faith this morning to say, God, I need you. Maybe you can muster enough faith this morning to say, God, without you, I have no hope. Maybe it's just a small prayer. Maybe you have enough courage to tell someone about what you're struggling with and ask for some support and some love and for them to pray with you and walk with you through this valley. But I'm telling you this, take a step of faith toward the Lord this morning, because God shows his kindness to people who step out in faith. See, the whole story hinges right here. If Ruth would have done what her sister-in-law did and gone back to Moab, we wouldn't have the rest of the story. But Ruth stepped out in faith. And because Ruth stepped out in faith, God was going to show kindness to her. That leads us to our third point. It covers the last 3 chapters of the book of Ruth. We're going to have to kind of speed through them. But the point is this: God's greatest kindness is redemption. Redemption means to buy back, to restore something as new. God was going to redeem Ruth's life. Now, to redeem, you need a redeemer. And that's the role of Boaz, a man who we meet in the story. He's going to be Ruth's redeemer, her qualified replacement husband. But how does this happen? Well, let's give the highlights of the story. So Naomi and Ruth have moved back to Israel. And as they're back in Israel, it's harvest time. So it's the fall. They're kind of gathering the grain. And the people of Israel have some laws that God had given through Moses about how you're supposed to harvest your fields. And one of those laws was, as you harvest your field, leave some grain on the edges of the field so that super poor people can come and take the edges of the field so that they'll have a little bit of food to eat. And so Ruth and Naomi are so impoverished that Naomi sends Ruth out as a day laborer to harvest the grain in that small little section of the corners of the field that the farmers have left unharvested. And so of all the fields in Israel, Ruth picks a field. It says verse 3 of chapter 2. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. So she happened to come. Now, friends, God's kindness has just shown up. And the text tells it to us in a rather ironic way. Because did Ruth just happen to show up in the field of Boaz? Maybe from her perspective. But from the perspective of salvation history, from the perspective of heaven, I bet her steps were directed. The kindness of God comes because he directs our steps in ways we couldn't have anticipated, to places we wouldn't have expected him to lead us, but his kindness shows up there. So here's this poor, broken widow harvesting in the field. It happens to belong to this guy named Boaz, who's in the family tree so he can function as a replacement husband. Remember, brother supposed to marry the wife of the deceased person. Well, if there is no brother, then there was a custom. It's not in the Bible that you have to do this, but there was a custom at the time that you could do this, that other male relatives, and you know how like if the president of the United States dies, there's like a line of this person's president next and this person is. That's kind of what they had. Like if a husband dies, this person should marry her, then this person, then this person, then this person. And so Boaz is in that line. And so Ruth just happens to stumble into his field. So he's an eligible replacement husband through the family custom of levirate marriage. And Boaz says to the people who are in charge of his reapers, this is verse 5, paraphrased here, "Who is that smoke show harvesting in my field?" And they're like, her name's Ruth. So he's like massively double taking, but there are a couple problems. He's old and she's a Moabite. And so he's rich, but he's like 55. And she's super young, super gorgeous, but a Moabite. And so they're both interested, but they both think that the other person's not going to be interested because of the obvious deficiency of what they've got going on. And so basically it's the plot of every Christmas Hallmark movie you've ever seen. So Ruth gets invited to eat with Boaz, and he sets her up with a prime harvesting spot, and he sends her home with extra food. And this is flirting. 1200 BC style. And so Ruth goes home to her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law is like, "Yo, what dude sent you home with all this food?" And Ruth's like, "Oh, some guy I met. His name's Boaz." And Naomi's wheels start spinning. And Naomi's like, he's eligible to be one of the guys who could be a redeemer and marry you. And you're like, why is Naomi trying to rush this marriage? Remember how I told you that she's harvesting at harvest time? And harvest time is in the fall. And after the fall comes, and how much harvesting is there in the winter? Yeah, zero, right? Zero. And so Ruth and Naomi are like toward the tail end of harvest time, and they've only got the food that they've harvested. And so they're facing a bunch of months with nothing in the cupboard. And Naomi's like, okay, Ruth, I'm old. You're the only one who might get married here. So you got to like make this happen in a month or we're going to starve. No pressure. And Ruth's like, I'm not even sure if bro's interested. And Naomi's like, oh, I'm pretty sure he's interested. Look at you. And so Naomi concocts this plan. And so this is chapter 3. And so Naomi's like, here, Ruth, I want you to go do this. I want you to go do that. I want you to do this and that. And so Naomi has Ruth put on her best black dress and spray herself with perfume. And after Boaz has just had his like end of harvest celebration dinner, and he's super happy and he's so excited that he falls asleep in his barn, Ruth shows up in the barn and she lays down at his feet while he's asleep. And in the middle of the night, Boaz wakes up and he's like, you're here. In fact, let's just read the story, verse 6 of chapter 3. So Ruth went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And at midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, there was a woman at his feet. Okay, I'm going to tell you, there's a lot going on in these verses. But this is pretty important stuff right here. I was just reading in a commentary this week from the Hebrew professor, Dan Hawk, at the seminary where I did my doctorate. And he pointed out, and I find this fascinating, the verbs used in verse 7 are super controversial. It says, Ruth came softly, Ruth uncovered his feet, and Ruth lay down. Now, there's a big, huge debate among people who study the book of Ruth as far as what exactly happened in that barn. And there's two lines of thought about what happened. And the first line of thought is those three verbs, she came in softly, she uncovered his feet, and she lay down. Those are all used in other places in the Bible, books that had already been written, like Genesis through Judges. Those exact verbs are used as euphemisms for sexual activity. And so there's this whole line of thought that Ruth snuck into the barn, did one of those try it before you buy it, seduce him type of things, and that was what happened. And you can find a lot of Bible scholars, specifically in the progressive Christian camp, who are like, that's exactly what Ruth did. But I don't think that's at all what Ruth did. But we have to ask, why did the man who wrote the book of Ruth use words that had those very specific connotations if that's not what happened? And here's why. And this, I think, is a pivot on which the whole story turns. The nation of Moab was conceived because a woman thought she had to take matters into her own hands and seduce someone. And so the nation of Israel was told to stay away from the nation of Moab because they're wicked people who will seduce you away from loving and serving God. And so there was an expectation that a Moabite like Ruth would lead her people, would lead the men of Israel into sin. But God was using those verbs in a way that was redemptively ironic. And here's what was going on. The expectation is that Ruth was going to lead Boaz into seduction and sin. But God was doing something far better. God was showing his kindness to Ruth, and he was showing that your expectations that people are outside the reach of God, your expectations that people will always do the wrong thing, your expectations that the wrong people from the wrong place, the wrong race, are always going to be people who do what God hates and never seek God, are completely subverted. And so you read the story thinking the Moabite is going to do what Moabites have always done, but God shows up. And God does what only God can do. And where we would expect to read sin and seduction, we instead read redemption and kindness. And so I think Ruth showed up at the barn, and she did exactly what the text says. There's no hidden euphemistic meaning here. She shows up and she says, when Boaz looks, "Who are you?" She says, "I'm Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Spread your wings over me. That's a pretty awesome marriage proposal. It reminds me of Psalm chapter 91, verse 1. He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. Boaz, I want you to do for me what God will do for his people. Cover me with your kindness. Cover me with your love. And because this is a dramatic story, we get an ironic twist. This is like your Hallmark movie again. Remember every Hallmark movie you've ever seen, right? The guy and the girl are ready to get together, but then there's this last minute twist. And it's like something might happen so that they're not going to be able to get together. And so I'm picturing that here are Ruth and Boaz, and she's like, "Spread your wings over me for your Redeemer." So like picture this as a movie, right? And the soundtrack kicks on. And I'm picturing Goo Goo Dolls, like it's the perfect song for this. I want to wake up where you are. Like literally that's what just happened. Put your arms around me. What you feel is what you are. What you are is beautiful. You want to get married? And that's exactly what's going on. Ruth's like, "You want to get married?" And Boaz is like, "Time out." And Ruth's like, "What?" So just picture, right? Like they're hugging and they're getting ready to kiss, and Boaz pulls away and he's like, "Wait, there's another Redeemer who's higher up on the list than I am. And so we got to see if he wants to marry you first." And Ruth's like, "I don't want to marry that dude." Boaz is like, "You got to ask him, because that's how things work in our culture." And so there's this last minute twist where Boaz has to go track down this other guy to ask him if he wants to marry Ruth. So Ruth goes home to Naomi. Naomi's like, "How'd it go?" Ruth's like, "Super good, except there's this other guy." And Naomi says, verse 18, "Wait, my daughter, you're going to learn how this matter turns out, for that man is not going to rest. He's going to get this thing settled today." Love that line. So Boaz goes and he tracks down this other guy, and he's like, "Hey, there's this lady who showed up, and she was in my field, and she wants to marry me, and I want to be her redeemer. But you're able to be a redeemer first if you want to, and do you want to marry her?" And this is the beginning of chapter 4, and the guy's like, no, that would mess up my inheritance. That would mess up my family situation. Not sure my wife's gonna be super happy if I come home with another wife. And so the obstacle's averted. The path is clear. Wedding bells. Quick cut to a year later at the end of the book where Ruth is holding a baby son. Naomi is now smiling, holding the baby. Bitter has become happy again, and the credits roll. Couple observations as we finish up the story. God's kindness is on full display. Ruth has gone from zero to hero because of faith. Look at what Naomi says to Ruth in chapter 4, verse 15. "This child shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to this child." So all the women in town, right? All the women in town are saying to Naomi, "Hey, your daughter-in-law is worth more to you than 7 sons because of how she stepped out in faith." And hear this. Naomi experienced redemption through Ruth, who experienced God's kindness. Redemption rewrites stories. 3 thoughts on redemption as we close. Here's the first one. Big picture takeaways from the book of Ruth. Here's the first one. Redemption came in Bethlehem. Of all the cities they could have lived in, they went and lived in a town called Bethlehem. Why? Because it was foreshadowing a greater redemption that was going to come from Bethlehem. Ruth's a Christmas story because the greater Redeemer would come from the same town where Ruth's story happened. Second observation, Boaz the Redeemer is a picture of Jesus the Redeemer. Like Ruth, we're a broken bride. Like Ruth, we have no family. Like Ruth, we are alienated from the people of God. Paul says in the book of Ephesians, we were alienated from God's people. We were without hope in this world, but God, being rich in kindness, poured out his mercy to us in Jesus Christ and adopted us into his family. And Boaz marrying Ruth was a picture, a foretaste of Jesus, the Redeemer, who would take us as his bride. And we who are hopeless and helpless can find redemption when we throw ourselves on the mercy of Jesus Christ. Ruth the Moabite, all through this book, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite. But look what happens in chapter 4, verses 11 and 12. She's now Ruth the Jew. The people who were at the gates and the elders said, we're witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house, that's Ruth, like Rachel and Leah, the matriarchs of the faith, who together built up the house of Israel. Verse 12, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. Ruth, the excluded outsider, is now listed in the hall of fame, of faith, of the greatest women in Israel's history. Ruth the Moabite is no longer Ruth the Moabite. She's now Ruth the Jew. She's part of the people of God because she was brought into the family of God. And no matter where you are, no matter what you've gone through, you can be brought into the family of God. Last observation, redemption gave Ruth great value. You wouldn't have expected it, but Ruth was the great-grandma of King David, the greatest king in the nation of Israel. Boaz and Ruth had Obed, who had Jesse, who had David, the king. David the king, the picture of Jesus Christ, the greatest king. See, here's what I want you to see as the band comes forward. Redemption can rewrite your story. And I don't know what your story is, but God's kindness and redemption can rewrite your story. And so this morning, I would encourage you to take that first step of faith and say, God, I give you my story. Rewrite it for your glory. Rewrite it for your good, because we have a God who rewrites stories. So we're going to sing a song together. It's a song we haven't sung on a Sunday morning before, but it's a blessing, speaking the name of Jesus into whatever situation you're going through. And I'd invite you, as this song plays, to use this opportunity, maybe just as a time of reflection. Just pray and say, Lord, I need Jesus to work his redemption in my story in this area. Give something specific to the Lord this morning. God, I ask that you would show up in our story and redeem them and rewrite them as an act of your loving kindness to the glory of Jesus Christ's name.